what is my meaningful purpose going to be when I retire? Retirement today is so different than, I talk about my grandfather. Combination of, do I have the confidence to retire financially? And then do I have the emotional confidence to know that I'm not going to miss work so much?
Paul, I know when a lot of our pre-retiree clients come in, probably the biggest thing they want to know is, what is my retirement going to look like? And when they ask that question, where do you typically start with them? What are some of the things that you say or some of the questions you might ask them as well?
Yeah, Ben, it's a great question because it is, a big topic for people when they look at their retirement. If you retire at 65 and you're working 40 years, with people's longevity today, you could be retired, 20, 30, 40 years as well. So it's really, providing that clarity and giving them guidance to make sure they're confident in making decisions today that are not going to adversely impact their future.
Sure. So when you say longevity and people living a long time, what are some of maybe the planning aspects around it that clients have concerns about, maybe outliving their money or running into additional risks, right? They're going to be involved with multiple market cycles where maybe historically it was maybe only one or two. And we know now we're in some pretty volatile markets, right?
Yeah.
So how do you help address some of those concerns?
A lot of that falls around traditional planning. But, as important to traditional planning where, we're looking at cash flows and, replacing a paycheck, right? People want to know, if I wake up, am I going to have a paycheck, right? How do I replace that paycheck? It's a very important, place for people to feel comfortable is making sure they have that paycheck. The other part about retirement that, people spend a lot of time trying to figure out, some successful and some unsuccessful, but it's really around, what is my meaningful purpose going to be when I retire? I've woken up and I've, put on my clothes every day, go to work. I have some sort of meaningful purpose. When I stop retiring, what is that meaningful purpose? And I think that's the part, where people really need to spend a lot of attention, understanding what are they going to do in retirement? Do they have any hobbies? Are they going to travel? Do they have grandkids? What is their health like, right? And so it's really making sure you have a sense of, who you are and your identity once you stop working.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Paul. I know, at least with my dad, when he retired from corporate America, I think he definitely struggled a little bit at first, just trying to figure out, what do I do? And probably drove my mom a little bit crazy along the way. But he actually started teaching at the local community college, and it became, financially, it wasn't something that was going to fulfill him, but emotionally and being that mental stimulation, it was something that was very fulfilling. I mean, he doesn't teach as often as he does, but he was teaching a few classes, and I remember he'd always talk about how class was going. He always talked about how many papers he had to grade, and he always was really excited to go. I mean, he would even drive to, we live in New Jersey, and he would sometimes drive to a diner in Connecticut and get this massive cookie, and he would bring the cookie back and share with his students, and it was very important to him, right? It really gave him that sense of fulfillment that I think you're talking about. And I totally agree with you. I think that for clients that are wondering on the financial side, I think financial planning definitely has its own challenges within of itself, but I think a lot of people struggle more of, well, what's next? What's that next chapter in life? And how do I write my own pages and provide myself that future that I want?
Yeah, and everybody's so unique, right? I mean, people will always ask me, a generic question, and my answer usually says it depends, right? And I hate giving that answer, but it's the honest answer, right? So, retirement today is so different than, I talk about my grandfather. And everything was done for them. They didn't need to save. He had a pension. They had Social Security. Their house was paid off when they retired, and it was, there was no, they weren't worried about traveling or anything else. It was just sort of continuing, their life but just not working. And it's so different today. Longevity. I mean, people are living so much longer. How does that impact, my retirement? Market volatility, right? I think one of the biggest things that we try to help people, in terms of visualizing the retirement is, what does it look like when the markets, are impacted, right? Because we're dependent upon the monies we've saved to provide that paycheck in retirement. What about healthcare? People make a lot of decisions around healthcare, making sure that, they're going to be well protected and not have any, events that, take away a large portion of their net worth. Yesterday I met with somebody and they were talking about retirement, and he never talked about not working. His retirement was, I don't want to work as hard. I want to make work optional, right? I want to be in a position where if I want to go to work, I'll go to work. But if I don't want to go to work, I want to go play golf and not have the responsibility of knowing that there's something waiting for me back at the office. So, retirement is very different, from your dad to, my dad to my grandfather and, everybody that's watching this video. Everybody's going to have a different sense of what their retirement looks like.
Right.
And again, it's to me, it's that combination of, do I have the confidence to retire financially? And then do I have the emotional confidence to know that I'm not going to miss work so much?
Sure. And when you say the financial confidence as well, Paul, it kind of stands out to me because I think we've talked a lot about the emotional confidence. What are some aspects? I mean, you've mentioned that planning for healthcare could be something that people often overlook, planning for market volatility.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to forget that volatility exists when markets are up, but it's very in your face when markets are down, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what are some things that you might say to a client that's worried about these things or maybe hasn't thought about them before?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I would say to people is, the importance of planning today is to make sure you're not making bad decisions that are going to really negatively impact your future. Right. And I think that's really what it comes down to is, when do I take Social Security? Right. How do I invest my money? What is the life expectancy I should really plan on? I mean, if we all knew when we were going to die, right, it would be easy because we would be planning to but people think, am I going to live to 75 or am I going to live to 95? I mean, that's a big difference. In terms of retirement income. So I think, knowing today and, putting a good plan together to address these issues to give you that confidence, makes the future, more predictable. Obviously, all those questions never go away in totality, but, to have a solid base, we were reading some research recently that said 83% of Americans are not confident or not very confident about their retirement. It's a big number. And that's different from years past. We don't have a model, for, having to provide our own retirement income because again, a lot of, the generations in the past, it was provided for them.
Right.
So these folks that are in retirement now and getting ready to retire are the first generations that are really, experiencing the longevity, having to plan on your own and, all that type of stuff that goes into it. And then you take inflation, and when we start looking at, the cost of goods as compared to 20 years ago, obviously the past couple of years have had a big impact on that. But, how do I keep, pace with inflation without taking a lot of risk?
Yeah, I think it's become a big challenge. I definitely agree. I think, we haven't talked about this yet, but taxes. I think tax planning has become such a forefront of retirement plans because we're in a position now where the tax laws are due to sunset at the end of the year, right? 2025. And I know a lot of clients have been thinking, well, what am I going to do? And I know for so many people and so many Americans, the traditional thought process or the standard way of thinking was put money in your 401k, you do it on a pre-tax basis, defer your taxes, defer your savings. And now a lot of people are pulling that money out and it's 100% taxable. And I wouldn't say it's a problem per se, but it's something that people just never were really planning for because they had kicked the can for so many years. And then now it's like, all right, you have your required minimum distributions. How do you deal with it, right? Does it create other tax traps? Does it cause other issues? Do you maybe have to take out more money than you expected because you said inflation is high, right? And when you take more money out, that's more taxes you have to pay. So you're basically getting hit over the head twice. And I think it's created a lot of, just as you said, very unique challenges that previous generations just never had to worry about, right? They got their pension, they got their Social Security, and they were good. I don't know anyone, maybe some of my police friends and teacher friends, but private sector friends, I don't know anyone that has a pension. It just doesn't exist anymore.
I'm hearing you talk and I'm hearing taxes and all the things we're talking about. And what's coming to my mind is the same but different. And what I mean by that is, the issues that we're talking about today are the same but different than they were 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, I remember having these conversations about taxes, but it was, much more off to the side. And today it's so much more in your face because, people believed that when we were putting this money away pre-tax, that we were doing it because we were going to be paying more taxes while we were working and lower taxes when we're retired. And that's not necessarily the case, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think just where tax rates are, a lot of people don't realize that taxes come in many different forms, whether it's through capital gains, through ordinary income. A lot of people don't realize that Medicare premiums are even income-based. So if you make too much money or make above a certain threshold, your Medicare premiums just go up by default.
Yeah.
Right? That's it's not necessarily a tax per se, but it's an additional cost because you're putting income on your 1040 every year because of those pre-tax accounts. And you're totally right, Paul. I think people just were not necessarily expecting it. I think a big thing too, we've talked about this before, but for sort of later years in retirement, right, is almost like that widower's penalty, where one spouse passes away and now the surviving spouse now has two retirement accounts to pull money from every year because the IRS forces them to. But they're filing as a single person.
Yeah.
They're not filing as married anymore. And their threshold to deduct is literally cut in half.
Yeah.
And it causes problems, right? It's something that catches so many people by surprise because it just wasn't planned for.
Yeah. And again, I think of retirement, with all these things that we have to, contend with. It's really people think that, retirement is a date. Right, I'm retiring next June. That's the start of a journey. It's not a date, And when I talk to people about retirement, they say, "Well, I'm retiring next year," and it's like, okay, that's the start of your journey, right? Because just like your working years were your career, right? So I had my career; it was a journey. I started when I got out of college, and I, worked until I retired, and then I have another journey of retirement. And just like what you did in your career, is exactly what we have to do for people in their retirement. It's not a destination, it's a journey. So, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me, Ben, because it's always fun to have these conversations, and it's been great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Definitely was good.